Hello everyone, and welcome back to my channel. My name is Katie. Today's topic, fantasy world building, specifically for you pantsers. Are you a pantser? Do you not outline at all? Does the thought of outlining make you shake? Make you think, oh God, I'm not going to want to write the actual book if I think it all through first? Well, I'm the exact same way. I didn't actually realize I was a pantser until I was about halfway through writing my first novel that I ever completed, The Wrath King, and I realized I probably wouldn't have finished it if I had outlined the entire thing, because it was much more fun to just kind of wander along and discover what the story was along the way. That's half the fun of pantsing, isn't it? Now, I am going to be trying some outlining techniques, and I don't think I'm a full-on pantser because I do some planning, but I think there's a difference between being a planner, or an outliner, and a pantser. But when it comes to fantasy, sometimes it's really difficult to be a pantser and write fantasy, because I feel like a lot of people who are fantasy authors plan. J.K. Rowling, George R.R. Martin. Just to pause for a very brief second, I was doing some research because I realized I misspoke and said George R.R. Martin when he is famously a pantser, and realized that a lot of fantasy authors are actually not very vigorous in their planning. For example, Neil Gaiman, Terry Pratchett, Douglas Adams, they're all pantsers, from what I can find. But I still think it's funny that there's this idea, or at least I was given the idea, that in order to write fantasy you have to plan a lot, and I think that probably comes from the fact that when I was younger looked up what J.K. Rowling does to write a fantasy book, and realized she's a planner. Granted, I don't really trust J.K. Rowling anymore because of the things that she has said, so I guess that's moot at this point. Anyway, J.R.R. Tolkien, he came up with an entire language before he started writing the book. At least I think he did. Don't quote me on that one. But the point still stands. There's the idea that you have to plan vigorously before you can write a fantasy book. And I'm not of that belief. Sure, if you're an outliner and you thrive off of that, and you're writing fantasy, I feel like you have a little bit of an easier job. But this video is for those of you who consider yourself pantsers and have been struggling with the fantasy genre, because it's kind of hard to pants the fantasy genre. So first, you have to ask yourself, why do I want to write this story? What draws you to it? What was your original conception when you came up with the idea? Is it a character? Is it a vibe? Is it a setting? Is it a specific scene? Most pantsers, and at least for me, I usually start with a scene and a couple characters and an aesthetic vibe that I want to go for when I'm writing. So keep what you're trying to get to, or what originally inspired you, in your mind when you're coming up with the idea. Now, I know it's difficult, but I do recommend that at some point in your process, you kind of brain dump everything you think you know about it onto a piece of paper, a document, a post-it note, into a journal that you keep all your writing ideas. It doesn't really matter. Just brain dump all of them onto the page. This will help you later on. If you lose a little bit of steam, you can go back to it and you can kind of figure out what originally inspired you and what originally you were working with. What I really like to stress is that as you write, you will get the shape and the feel and the vibe of the story. Sometimes it may not be the same as what you had in your head, but at the end of the day, it's what the story is. And there's always revision. Technique that you can use is fast drafting or zero drafting. I kind of do this, but essentially what it is that you write down everything and you just go. You don't figure out anything else. You just leave brackets where you don't know stuff and you just write down the entire story. And then in your first draft, you can go back and add those things in, but you've essentially vomited the story onto the page. This works for some. I personally don't do that, but my process is different. Another tip, which I'm sure works for everyone, and not just those in the fantasy genre, is to read books within your genre. And read them diligently. Read them and take notes on what you like. Figure out what you like, what you don't like, and what you might want to incorporate into your own story. What I also would suggest if you are a pantser and you don't like coming up with ideas first before you write the story, is to do a little bit of Wikipedia research. Read historical accounts, read those kinds of things. It depends on what kind of genre your fantasy is. If it's a traditional fantasy, if it kind of veers more into sci-fi, read some more sci-fi books. It's all about bringing your knowledge higher up and knowing how to do those things by actually reading polished work. If you do just want to dive straight into the book and not do any planning, if you are a very vigorous pantser and you just write the story, What I would recommend is keeping a separate document of all the things that you discover about the characters that you write in while you're drafting. This makes it easier to go back and build off those things later on when you eventually have to do a little bit more planning. I think the biggest thing that might hold a pantser back, and it has before with me, is the fact that when you're building an entire world, an entire society, an entire culture, it feels really overwhelming. Like, whoa, I have to create an entire people and they have to be original too? Woo! It's crazy, but that's part of the allure. That's part of why I love fantasy, is the fact that I get to create my own world and make my own rules, and I don't have to follow anybody else's rules. I have a problem with authority, if you couldn't realize. But at the end of the day, you have to keep it simple. Do you really need to know how the complicated monarchy is going to be if your main character is a thief living on the streets? No. You don't have to George R. R. Martin this shit right now. You don't have to know what's happening halfway across the world from your story. If it's not relevant to what you're writing about, don't include it yet. If you have an idea for it, write it down in your info dump folder or write it in your journal as like a little side note, but you don't actually have to physically think about those things and really move forward with those things if they're not relevant to the story you're trying to tell. Do I need to know who every single person in my monarchy's lineage is? No. Do I need to know what kind of specific spice someone is going to use if in a separate continent, if it's never going to come up and if it's not actually relevant to the plot? Those are details you can add in later when you think you need them and where you need them. My first step, info dump. I create a Scrivener file for this story. I make a separate page and I just dump every single thing that I know about that story into the page. And then I build off of it. You can do this on paper. I personally prefer to use the computer because my left hand writing is not nearly as fast as actually typing. The second thing that I usually do is I go on Pinterest and I make myself an aesthetic mood board. This helps me get the vibe of the story, helps me feel what the story will be like, gives me some ideas to marinate in my head of the descriptions I want to use. I'm a descriptive writer. That's why I love fantasy so much, because I love describing gowns and jewels and crowns and weapons and all this kind of fun stuff that I include in my fantasy, because that's what I like. What do you like? Find what you like and write that. What then you do is I usually go and I steal some ideas from other people. And when I say this, I don't mean actually physically steal and plagiarize, but it all comes back to learning from others. There's a book, if I can find it. Aha, there it is. I highly recommend this book, Steal Like an Artist by Austin Kleon, I think is how you pronounce it. And essentially, it's a really short book, very fun. It essentially talks all about the making of stuff. It talks about productivity, building your own world, copying. He literally says, start copying. Start copying. That's the only way you're going to learn, especially if you're new to the genre. Personally, for me, I would have to read a lot of contemporary and write a lot of contemporary that is similar to other contemporaries because I don't write contemporary. But since I was a little kid, I've been writing fantasy, so I know the fantasy genre fairly well. Obviously, there are still things that I can improve on, as evidenced by my shelves and all these unread books. There are 2 more shelves above this that have even more books than I need to read. So when I'm building stuff, what I find I do first is making a religious and magic system. Now, not all fantasy has to have magic or religion in it, but I typically find that those are themes and tropes that I particularly like in my own fantasy. These 2 things are usually pretty interconnected in the worlds that I make. So that's what I do first. And I work on those. I talk about the gods, the deities, the kind of basic history of the world is. Nothing crazy, nothing wild. I mean, you can start with anything. Geography, family lines, animals, the different capitals, the cities, what you like. Like, you could start with a myth. Like, if you're writing a mermaid book, you could write about the myth of the mermaids. What initially drew you to the story? You can start with a character and build the story completely around them. That's sometimes what I do. I usually start with a character and build from there. And I have lots of characters because I'm a character whore, but that's a whole other topic. So then you break those things into bits and see how it will shape your world. And it'll hopefully bring you closer to what this world is. And then it'll hopefully give you a platform that you can stand on when you do start writing. If the beginning of your story starts with a death, it might be helpful to know what the funeral rites are. Or if it starts with a wedding or a birth, it might be helpful to know what your culture that you've created thinks about those kinds of things. And these are things you can just kind of jot down in bullet points. Doesn't have to be anything fancy. It'll inform what you do within your narrative. And I think that's what's really important with world building, is everything you do should help you understand your world better so you can better convey it to others. My last final parting words of wisdom is you don't have to know everything. You really don't. As you write and you build your story, you'll find it. You'll find your things. You have to keep thinking about what originally inspires you to write this. And if what you're working on with world building doesn't continue to inspire you, you need to move on and you need to not write those things yet. They'll come to you, I promise. And even if they don't, that's work for another time, when you've already actually physically written the manuscript. If the world building you're trying to do isn't fun and it isn't helping you develop your story so that you're excited to actually write, you shouldn't be doing that portion of the world building. That will come at a later date, because if you get bogged down with these details now and you don't actually want to write the story, you never will. And then those details will be useless. Or you can recycle them. Recycling is a great thing. I recycle all the time. And last, but certainly not least, trust your gut. Trust your instinct, your muse, whatever you want to call it. Trust yourself. You know when you're ready. And if you start writing and you aren't, and you need to go back and world build, that's fine. This process isn't a one size fits all. What I do may not be good for you. That is what I do to world build. And that is my tips for you as a pantser myself. Caveat side note. I have also linked things down in the description. Tumblr links, questionnaires, character surveys, world building things, and a couple of other things that I use when I'm world building to help my process. If you do find that you need some more resources when it comes to world building, or you don't know where to find a certain thing, or you have more detailed, in-depth questions about a very specific way a river flows, you'll find that all down below. I am not the end-all be-all of knowledge, but I do hope that this pep talk for you, a pantser, was helpful. That's what I'm here to do. Make sure to leave your comments down below. Let's discuss world building, what kind of genre you're in, if the genre really matters when it comes to world building. In my opinion, it does. If you're writing a 50s noir thriller, you should probably do some world building and research. If you liked this video and found it at all helpful, it would be really great if you hit the like button. It really tells me that you're liking my content. If you really like my content, make sure to hit the subscribe button and check out a couple of my other videos. I will see you in my next video. Bye!